Well, hello, fellow pilots. I'm John King.
And I'm Martha King. Welcome to Rules to Fly By. This course is packed full of useful everyday information on how to get the most utility out of your aircraft, as well as enhanced safety.
And we're going to cover the hidden secrets in your pilot's operating handbook.
You'll learn how to prevent mechanical problems, and we've got a special section on how to avoid being deceived by the optical illusions of flight.
And just to keep you up to date and out of trouble, we've included a review of federal aviation regulations that every pilot should know.
But right now, let's get started as John gives us some real-life information about airplane operations.
All right, let's talk about some helpful hints for aircraft operations. I need all the helpful hints I can get. And the first helpful hint we want to talk about is a narrower than usual runway can create the illusion that the airplane is at a higher altitude on approach than it really is. And the reason for that, of course, is when you're high, the runways look narrow, and if you see a very narrow runway, it's going to make you think you're high. What's that going to do to you? Well, it's likely to cause you to fly too low on approach. You're going to run the risk of striking obstacles or landing short. Another thing about a narrow runway, if you see a narrow runway, it looks longer. Notice how this runway looks longer than this one. The reason for that is long runways generally have a greater ratio of length to width. So if you see a narrow runway, it makes you think it's long. Now, what that could cause is that you might just land too long and run off the end of the runway because you thought the runway was longer than it really was. How do you get around these two problems? Well, you know the runway length and you know the runway width before you land. On the other hand, let's assume that you have a wider than usual runway. Well, if you have a wider than usual runway, it's going to do the opposite to you. It's going to make you think that you're too low. And what you're going to do then is, if you don't recognize the illusion, is you're going to be too high, and you're going to have the risk of flaring high, landing hard, and overshooting the runway. Also, a wide runway, if you take a look at it here, a wide runway also looks shorter. And if you take a look at this, it looks like it's a short runway. And once again, that could make you make a different kind of approach than you normally would. So once again, knowing the runway length and the runway width will be a big help to you before you land in an airport. Now let's talk about how the runway slope might just affect the way you're going to land. And let's assume you're taking an approach to an airport and there is a upsloping runway. In other words, the runway slopes up like this. Well, that could create the illusion that you're too high. Let's take a look at what that's going to look like. Now, if you think you're too high, what you're going to do is you're going to come in low, and here you look high because the runway slopes up like so. You think you're high, and you're likely to make a shallow approach. So you tend to fly too low, and you could run into trees or terrain. You could get yourself behind a power curve and actually climbing to the runway in some cases. So you got to be particularly careful if the runway has a slope one way or the other. And you should be particularly cautious in an airport with upsloping and narrower than usual runways because you could wind up being too low and dragging the airport back up to the runway. You can actually get to the point where you're having to climb to the runway in some cases. On the other hand, if you had a downsloping runway or downsloping terrain leading to that runway on approach, that can create the illusion that you're too low when in fact you're not, and then you can wind up being too high and overshooting the runway. So I think we can show you that in just a second here. And here's what it looks like. The downsloping runway makes it look like you're low, and in fact you have a tendency to fly too high. You could overshoot the runway. And once again, you want to be particularly cautious if you have both a downsloping runway and a wider than usual runway. You could come in way too high. Now, let's take a look at another little trick, and I think this is a very helpful one. And this is an assist to line up with the runway center line. You know, a lot of people look at the window of the airplane, look at the center of the airplane, they think they're lined up with the runway, and they're not. And sometimes if you're riding with an instructor, you'll notice the instructor says, get on the runway center line, and you think you're on the runway center line. You say, what's wrong with this instructor? He thinks I'm not on the center line, and I am. Well, the reason you're disagreeing about it is you might be looking at different things. You might be looking at where the runway is on the windshield, and he might be looking at the shape of the runway. And the most reliable way to tell whether or not you're on the runway center line when you're coming in on final is to look at the shape of the runway. When you're on center line, you'll notice that the angle between the threshold and the runway edge is equal on each side. But if you get the center line to your left, in other words, you're to the right of center line, notice that this angle is different than this angle, and the runway takes a different shape. It takes kind of a trapezoidal shape. If you watch the shape of the runway so that see how it goes back and forth like this, you'll notice that the runway takes a shape so that this angle is a smaller angle, this angle is a bigger angle, and it actually looks like that to you when you're approaching the land. So now if you get on over here to the runways to your right, you're to the left of center line, then you'll see the same thing, that the far angle gets smaller and the near angle gets bigger, and that's why you can tell whether or not you're left or right of center line without having to look at how the runway looks as far as the windshield is concerned on the aircraft, because you're not sitting in the center of the aircraft. People might line up different in the chairs of the aircraft or the seats of the aircraft, but the runway shape is your best way to tell. And the first way to start studying this is if you're making an approach at nighttime. You'll see this at nighttime, and you get into the habit of it, you're going to be on runway center line every time. So make a note, a mental note to yourself, look at the runway shape as you're going down final, and that'll tell you whether you're left, right, or on center line. How about that, sports fans? Now let's talk about another rule, and that's the absence of ground features such as landing over darkened areas, like you're landing over water or snow at nighttime, can create the illusion that you're higher than you actually are. Why? Because you're seeing no detail on the ground, and when the lack of detail, your brain has learned to interpret as being high. So whenever you're flying over a dark area, water, snow, or even if you have poor visibility, like you have rain on the windshield, that can create the illusion that you're higher than you really are. Rain on the windshield gives you less detail on the ground, and if the lights are dimmer than normal, it'll make you think you're high. Now, the lights can be dim because there's rain or low visibility, or they have dim runway lights. Any of those things make you think you're higher than you really are. And if you don't recognize these illusions, you're likely to fly a lower approach path. And matter of fact, you can get dangerously low where you get trees going by the windshield if you're not careful. Now, let's assume that you're flying through an unknown canyon. Why would you fly through an unknown canyon? I don't know why you'd fly through an unknown canyon, but let's assume you are. That's not too smart to begin with. But remember that some canyons run into a dead end, and you might like to make a 180-degree turn. Well, if you fly on one side of that canyon instead of down in the middle, now you have the whole canyon width to turn around in instead of just half the canyon to turn around in. So the rule is, anytime you're flying in a canyon and you may want to turn around, fly with the canyon off to one side. Fly on one side of the canyon. That way you have the whole width of the canyon in which to turn around. Now here's another rule. If you get a situation in which you think you might want to turn around, like you're flying in a canyon or you're flying in some other closed space and you want to turn around, or even if you're flying in low visibility. For instance, let's assume that you're flying in low visibility on a short little trip from one airport to another airport, and you may want to turn around. The thing for you to do is to slow that airplane down, because the slower the airspeed, the smaller the turn radius at any given bank angle. Well, how much does the airspeed affect the turn radius? Well, let's take a look at it. At a given bank angle, the turn radius varies with the square of the airspeed. Now let me see if I can make some more sense out of that for you. In other words, let's take a look at it. If you cut the airspeed in half, you reduce the turn radius to a quarter. So now once again, reduce your airspeed to a half. Let's assume that you were flying an airplane at, we'll say 180, and you slow it down to 90. You're going to reduce the turn radius to 1/4. So slowing the airplane down makes a huge difference. Here's 80 knots and here's 160 knots. You slow the airplane down, you reduce the turn radius to 1/4. So in low visibility or in canyon flying, the name of the game is get that airplane slowed down, and then you can get turned around much better. Now let's talk about another rule of thumb. Let's assume you're in mountainous or desert terrain and you want to fly on a cross country. When should you plan the trip? Well, if you want a smooth trip, if you don't want to be bouncing around in turbulence, plan that trip for early morning hours. So to minimize turbulence in mountains or the desert, fly before 10 a.m. or after 4 p.m. Why? Well, usually the air starts to become turbulent around 10 a.m. and it steadily gets worse until about 4 p.m., then gradually improves till dark. Why? Because sunshine, convective activity is what causes the turbulence, and you're trying to fly when the convective activity is minimized. Now, let's talk about, while we're talking about flying in the mountains here, landing at a high-altitude airport. When you're landing at a high-altitude airport, let me ask you a question. Should you approach at the same indicated airspeed as normal, higher or lower? And the answer is, when you're landing at a high-elevation airport, now it's true, there's thin air at high altitudes, but you want to approach at the same indicated airspeed at high altitudes as you would at low altitude. And the reason for that is there is thin air at high altitudes, but that thin air affects your wings in exactly the same way it affects your indicated airspeed indicator. So you want to approach the land at the same indicated airspeed at high altitude as you would at low altitude. And that gives you, of course, a higher speed over the ground, so you're going to touch down at a higher speed, and your landing distance will be longer. But you want to land at the same indicated airspeed as normal because that'll give you the same margin over the stall as normal. So what you should do then is land at the same indicated airspeed as normal. But when you're doing that, what you're going to find is your speed over the ground will actually be faster, and your rate of descent for the same glide path will actually be faster. So if you're at a high altitude airport and you're approaching to land, we'll say with 80 knot approach speed, and your normal rate of descent, we'll say, would be 400 feet a minute. Well, now you might find your rate of descent is 500 or 600 feet a minute. So on flare, if you flare the same way, you may find that you flare a little bit short and land hard. You may want to add a little power for flare at a high altitude airport because your rate of descent is higher and your ground speed is higher, and you're going to need a little adjustment. So consider adding a little power for flare at a high altitude airport. All right, now let's talk about a bugaboo that has affected a lot of people that I know who fly regularly, and that is hearing loss. Just about any old-time pilot I know has a little bit of hearing loss, and some not-so-old-time pilots have a little hearing loss, and it's a real factor in personal general aviation airplanes. So, the rule of thumb, if you want to minimize hearing loss, make a habit of using earplugs or a noise-attenuating headset. Why? Why is that important? Well, because it happens to everybody, and once you have established hearing loss, you're not going to get it back because normally it's an irreversible type thing. So the answer to it is, let's head it off, you might even want to consider having your passengers use earmuffs or headsets. And so what it is a continued exposure to excessive noise diminishes the hearing acuity with high frequency response, failing first, and then the middle frequencies go, and then finally all your hearing goes. So you might want to use earmuffs, earplugs, something of that sort, and but the earplug has been proven by far to be the most satisfactory and the least expensive protection overall, so you might want to consider that and even offer them to your passengers. All right, now let's assume that you and I are going on a cross-country trip and we're going VFR. Now, would it be a good idea to file an alternate airport on your VFR flight plan? Well, the answer is, of course it would. It's not required. You and I both know it's not required, but it's a good idea to plan ahead and always have an alternative course of action in mind in case the trip cannot be completed as planned. As a matter of fact, the FAA requires, with the regulations, you always have an alternative course of action in mind. So as a VFR pilot, there's no reason in the world that you cannot list an alternate down here in your flight plan. And so then, if you can't land at your destination because of fog, high winds, disabled aircraft on the runway, you've already made a decision about where you want to go. Now let's talk about some of the considerations you should think about when you're choosing an alternate airport. And by the way, these same considerations would apply for an IFR alternate as well as a VFR alternate. First of all, you might want to pick an airport that is short of your destination, because you're going to be calling ahead on the radio and find out what your destination weather is, and if your destination weather has gone to pot, it's really deteriorated, then you can just land short and you're going to have plenty of fuel. So a good rule of thumb is pick a destination, pick an alternate that's short of your destination. Now, of course, if you're a VFR-only pilot, real wise idea to pick an alternate that's forecast to be VFR. You don't want to go someplace that's going to cause you trouble. Now, so you can be flying into the wind, or you can be flying downwind, and you can be flying uphill in the mountains or downhill in the mountains. Best of all, pick an alternate airport that's downwind, so you have a high ground speed instead of a low ground speed and you use less fuel. Also pick an alternate airport that's downhill. If you're in the mountains, go to lower elevations for your alternate, not higher elevations. So good rule of thumb, anytime you're picking an alternate airport in your mind, go downwind and downhill. Of course, it's a wise idea to pick one with multiple runways in case there's a cow on the runway that you're landing at, or a broken down truck, or snow plow on the runway that gets broken down and can't get off. Whatever the reason is, things actually do go wrong with runways. Runways get flooded, you get snow plows on them, you get trucks on them, you get disabled airplanes on runways. If you have multiple runways, the chances are higher that one of them is going to be able to be available for you to land on. Same way with multiple approach aids. When Murphy's Law strikes and things are going bad, they're likely to go bad all at once, and you're likely to lose your approach aids. So pick multiple runways, multiple approach aids, and try and pick an alternate airport that's not on the other side of a weather front. You don't want to fly through the nastiest weather in the world to get to your alternate airport. So here's some rules of thumb. Even if you're a VFR-only pilot, and even if you're going on a VFR-only trip, it's a good idea to have an alternate airport, and these are the things you should be thinking about when you're picking your alternate. Now, let me ask you kind of a little puzzlement question. We talk a lot about the density of the air and your density altitude. And one of the questions I want to ask you right now is, which is more dense, would you say, moist air or dry air? And the answer is dry air. The molecules are closer together. You say, now, wait a minute. We all know that moisture is heavy. But what people don't really understand when they're talking about the moisture of the air and the effect it has on the atmosphere is that steam, and actually I shouldn't say steam, water vapor in the air is actually less dense than the air itself. So when the humidity goes up, the air becomes less dense and your density altitude is actually higher. And it gives you a higher density altitude. So a lot of people have the misconception that this is the opposite of that, but water vapor actually weighs less than an equal amount of dry air, and so a dry parcel of air would be denser and heavier than a moist parcel. Now, since both your engine and aircraft performance decrease with density altitude, anytime you have a high relative humidity, that means a small spread between the temperature and dew point, and particularly on a hot summer day, this is going to result in a longer takeoff run and a reduced rate of climb. So they always say, watch out for the triple H's. Watch out when it's hot, high, and humid, because high humidity increases your density altitude. So if you're in the mountains and it's hot and you're at high altitude, and if the humidity is higher, you might remember that your density altitude is higher and your performance is not going to be as good as you might have thought it was going to be. So, if you find it's necessary to clear obstacles after takeoff and it's a high density altitude, be careful. You're going to have to do the best performance possible. And by the way, if you want the best performance possible and you're trying to clear obstacles after takeoff, do you want the best rate of climb speed or best angle of climb speed? Which do you want? Well, if you're trying to clear an obstacle after takeoff, you want to climb, first of all, at the best angle of climb speed. And that's the one that gives you the best altitude gained over the distance covered over the ground. But now, after you've cleared the obstacles, you want to climb to get the most altitude in the least amount of time. Then you want to climb at the best rate of climb speed. Here's the difference. Well, the best angle of climb speed, as we said, gets you the most altitude gain for each foot that you travel over the ground. And so that gives you the most altitude over distance over the ground. Best rate of climb speed, on the other hand, gets you to a higher altitude faster. But over a given point over the ground, if you're trying to clear an obstacle, the best angle of climb speed gets you higher over a given point over the ground. So as you can see, it might be a mistake to use the best rate of climb speed when you were looking for the best angle of climb speed. Of course, you want to have both of those speeds memorized for your particular airplane that you're flying. Now, here's a puzzlement question coming up. What do you think makes an airplane climb? Excess thrust or excess lift? What do you think? Well, the answer is an airplane climbs because it has excess thrust, and that's also horsepower, more power than necessary for straight and level flight at that speed. If you have more power than necessary for straight and level flight at that speed, you're going to have excess thrust, and that makes an airplane climb. You say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense to me. Well, for instance, let's assume you have an airplane that can climb vertically, then you'd go right straight up and it'd be all thrust making the airplane climb. We'll take a look at that in just a second. But if you take a look at vector analysis of the forces in the climb, you'll reveal that, you'll find out that because of the incline thrust factor, lift is less than weight. For instance, here's the case here's the power available to the airplane, here's the power required, and when you get your maximum climb is when you have more power available than is required for the airplane to fly. And by the way, this is the speed of the aircraft across the bottom, and the power available and required is on the left-hand side. And it's this excess power over the amount required to make the airplane fly straight and level at that speed, that's what makes the airplane climb. And if you don't have any excess power, any excess thrust, your airplane is not going to climb. So what makes an airplane climb? Excessive power over that amount required to make the airplane fly in straight and level speed. Now let's take a look at an airplane that might be climbing straight up, and you can see that here's a case when you have a lot of excessive power, and you could be climbing with absolutely no lift at all on the wings because it's the power making you climb. So what makes an airplane climb? Excessive power over that amount required to make an airplane fly straight and level at that speed. And that's why, by the way, it's that power that makes you climb that you have to add power to climb or to stretch a glide rather than just pitch the nose up. You can pitch the nose up, but unless you have excessive power, all you're going to do is sink some more. Now, let's assume that you're about ready to go on a trip and you're going to use electrical power on the ground, we'll say to listen to the radios or turn on lights at night. And you want to keep from running your battery down. Well, what you should do if you have a split master switch in your airplane is turn only on the battery half of the master switch. If you have a split master switch, the other half turns on the alternator. Now, what you're doing when you're turning on the alternator is you're charging the field on the alternator. It actually takes some current from the battery to run it through the alternator to energize the alternator, and this is necessary for the alternator to put out any power at all. So you're charging the field on the alternator, and you don't need to do that if you're just sitting there listening to a radio, and it takes some extra energy out of the battery to charge the field on the alternator. So, rule of thumb, what you should do is, if you're listening to a radio or using lights at night, turn on only the battery half of your master switch. Don't turn on the alternator half of your master switch. All right, now other old-timers' rule of thumbs. Now, I'm not an old-timer. I just talked to a lot of old-timers, and old-timers tell me when you're checking the magnetos, first go 2 detents to the left, and that'll be checking the right mag because you're shutting off the left mag. Then go back to both. Then go back 1 detent to the left, and now you're checking the, I think I said the right mag last time, so it must be the left mag this time, and then go back to both. Now, what you do when you use this method is you're never going to, or you shouldn't anyway, accidentally leave the switch on 1 mag, and which would normally be the left, and take off. And of course, I have made takeoffs on 1 mag before. I think about anybody has, and you can avoid that, or at least minimize the chances of doing it if you follow this procedure. Now, after checking the second magneto, all it's going to take is 1 click to bring you back the mags back to both. And you just kind of have that in mind, and if you follow that habit, you're less likely to take off on 1 mag. Now, let's assume during this run-up you're checking carburetor heat. And you're, of course, going to check for an RPM drop when you pull carburetor heat. But what you should also look for is an RPM rise when you put the carburetor heat back off. Why? Well, of course, everyone checks for an RPM drop with carb heat on. But if the cable or actuating arm is going to break, it's going to break when you've pulled the carburetor heat on. That's the way life goes. That's Murphy's Law. And if you don't watch when you push it back on, you might not detect that there's no RPM rise, and you might wind up taking off with carburetor heat on. So as a rule, always check not only that you get a carb drop, or it's kind of RPM drop when you pull on carburetor heat, but also you get an RPM rise when you take carburetor heat off. How about that, sports fans? Now, let's assume you have an airplane with a constant speed propeller that frequently has a large RPM drop during the magneto check due to lead fouling or oil in the spark plugs. Here's a procedure that you should consider that will help eliminate that mag drop when you're doing the mag check, and that is consider exercising the prop before doing the mag check. And what's that do for you? Well, you increase the cylinder pressures when you exercise the prop, and that might just be enough to clean the mag so that following the mag check following will be satisfactory. So consider exercising the propeller before doing a mag check. You're less likely to get a mag drop when you check the mags. Now, let's assume that you're leveling off at cruise altitude after a climb, and you want to get to cruise speed. Well, during level off, after a climb, the best way to get to cruise speed in almost any type of airplane is don't pull back to cruise power until you've gotten cruise speed. Just leave your climb power in and let the airplane accelerate to cruise speed. Now, this has several advantages for you. First of all, put the aircraft at cruise speed and minimum time with less time spent in constant retrimming, and it'll get you there a lot quicker, and the airplane will be more stable. So, as a rule, and almost everybody does it who flies heavy iron, you talk to the airline pilots flying the jets, they'll do exactly the same thing. Leave the climb power in until you've gotten cruise speed. You're going to spend less time trimming the airplane and minimum time accelerating. All right, now let's talk about approaching and landing in an uncontrolled airport. And we're slinging these helpful hints at you at a fast rate here. And the rule is, and everybody knows this, but let's talk about a lot of reasons why. Never make a straight-in approach to an uncontrolled airport. Well, why? We all know that you shouldn't do it, but let's talk about reasons for it. First of all, the highest probability, statistics indicate, of mid-air collision risk is one aircraft overtaking another aircraft or descending atop of another on straight-in approaches to an uncontrolled airport. If you want to know where mid-airs occur, people, the general public thinks mid-airs occur while you're flying along. No, mid-airs occur at airports. and mid-airs generally occur at uncontrolled airports, and mid-airs normally occur at airplanes making, or with airplanes making a straight-in approach to an uncontrolled airport. You can very much minimize your mid-air risk by simply following the procedure of flying a traffic pattern. It's just simply a matter of putting the odds in your favor. And if you want to put the odds in your favor, don't make a straight-in approach to an uncontrolled airport. Fly the traffic pattern. Don't be tempted. Now, let's assume you have decided you do want to fly the traffic pattern in an uncontrolled airport. How do you enter the pattern? Of course, you always enter the traffic pattern on a 45-degree angle to downwind at midfield. What's the problem with that? Well, there's an optical illusion that people have that makes them want to get into the departure aircraft pattern if they're not careful. Let's take a look at what the problem is. If you're making a 45 and you're aiming for the midpoint on the runway, what you wind up doing, instead of making the 45 at, and coming in at the midpoint downwind, you wind up aiming for the midpoint on the runway. What you really instead should do, and I'll make this more clear as we go along here, what you really should instead do is aim for the end of the runway. And what that will do is put your midpoint, the point where you arrive at the midpoint, on downwind instead of the middle of the runway. Now here's what that does for you. If you aim for the middle of the runway instead of the end of the runway, you're actually going to arrive at the pattern, not at the midpoint of the pattern, but at the midpoint of the runway, but you're going to arrive over here near these departures going out. And these departures and you could mix it up with each other. And so the whole idea is you want to avoid, the reason you're flying a traffic pattern is to standardize where you're going and to avoid other aircraft. And since you want to avoid these departures, you don't want to fly down in this area, you instead want to fly over here, and to do that you aim your 45 downwind for the runway end. But when you turn downwind, it'll actually put you midfield downwind. How about that? So, if you aim at the runway midpoint, you'll enter the pattern near the crosswind to downwind turn, instead of if you aim at the runway end, which you should do, then you're going to be at the right place. So, by the way, always enter the pattern, of course, at pattern altitude for that particular airport. It's very wise to look that up. So once again, a little pre-flight planning will help you more than anything else. Now, let's assume that you're flying along, and you've got a choice as to when you switch tanks. And my wife and I used to fly to Alaska a lot, and we used to deliberately avoid switching tanks over wild and dangerous terrain because, sure as the devil, when you're switching a tank, the lever's going to break off in your hand, or the valve will bind in between positions, and you're not going to be able to use your fuel, and the engine's going to quit. So rule of thumb, switch tanks over or within gliding distance of an airport. And if you're flying over terrible, terrible terrain, you're out there by yourself in the boondocks, try and not switch tanks until you get near civilization. Because Murphy's Law says, sure as the devil, that darn handle is going to come off in your hand when you're switching tanks, and you're going to be up a creek without a paddle. So try and switch tanks near an airport, certainly not over the wild boondocks if you can avoid it. All right, now here's another one we need to talk about, and that is when you're using carburetor heat. One of the things you need to know about carburetor heat is you're bypassing the air filter. And when you're using carburetor heat, or if you're in a fuel-injected engine, you're using alternate air, you're using unfiltered air. And you have the chance of dust and grit and dirt getting into the engine. So you want to minimize, by all means, using carburetor heat or alternate air in dusty conditions, and particularly on the ground, you want to minimize using carburetor heat or alternate air. Now, also, another rule of thumb, just something you ought to look at on your airplane, is when you have the knob in the off position. What you should do when the knob is in the off position is make sure it's not butted up against the panel. You want a minimum amount or a small amount of space between the knob and the panel to make sure that the travel is completely done and that the door is actually closed. If the panel is stopping it instead of the door stopping it, you might think you have your carburetor heat or alternator off, and you might have it on just a little bit. Now, there are aircraft like Mooney's that have what they call a ram air feature. And these aircraft have a case where they bypass, once again, the air filter, and the ram air gives you a little manifold pressure rise. And this happens on Mooney's. It's a terrific idea, but it only works when you have full throttle. So if you think you want to get this ram air benefit, make sure that you're using full throttle. That particularly works in a Mooney. One of the things you need to know, though, is when you are using that ram air feature in a Mooney, you're getting unfiltered air. So once again, alternate air, ram air, carburetor heat all give you unfiltered air. Now here is one of the smartest rules of thumb you'll ever see. Never never trust a fuel gauge. And I know someone who just recently ran out of fuel in an airplane simply because he forgot this rule. You never trust a fuel gauge. Just assume that your gauges in your airplane do not work. In fact, recently I got myself in great trouble and landed with far less fuel than I should have because the gauges were wildly off. And you can plan on the gauges being wildly off. So what do you go by? You go by time. We used to have a little kitchen timer that we timed how much fuel each tank. We just turned this kitchen timer for 45 minutes, and when the bell rang on the kitchen timer, then we knew that tank was empty, whether the gauge said it was or not. One time the timer stuck at the same time the float collapsed in the air, or actually the tank collapsed, the rubber fuel cell collapsed in the airplane, and we wound up having an engine quit and gliding for some distance before we got the engine started again. So, never trust a fuel gauge. Now, when is the airplane required to have accurate gauges? Well, when it leaves the factory. And at what reading is that gauge required to be accurate? Only empty. That's the only time the gauges in your airplane are required to be accurate, is when they read empty. So conceivably, I don't think anybody designed a gauge to do this, but conceivably they could go from full to empty instantaneously, and they're accurate when they read empty. Kind of leaves you in a fix. Now, here are some things that can go wrong with gauges. The floats can hang up, just they're mechanical floats, they can get hung up. They can leak, they can sink, the rubber fuel cells can collapse, you can have electrical characteristics change. All of these things means your gauges may not be accurate. So the answer is, do use fuel consumption over time, or a fuel totalizer is a wonderful investment. I've used a fuel totalizer, I like it an awful lot, but remember, gauges don't work in general aviation airplanes. It's just a solid rule of thumb. Always go by time, never trust your gauges. All right, now let's talk about when starting an aircraft engine. Once again, if you want to save your battery, we've already talked about this to some extent, leave the alternator half of the master switch off. Why? Well, again, the alternator takes energy to charge the field. You're not going to be using the alternator when you start the engine, so start the engine first, then turn on the alternator half of your master switch. How about that? All right, let's take a look at our next rule of thumb coming up. Your airplane has a starting procedure, and almost always it involves using the primer correctly rather than pumping the throttle. So a good rule of thumb from a knowledgeable person like an A&P mechanic or a flight instructor, learn to use your aircraft primer for your airplane correctly. Many people pump the throttle, and what we're getting at here is the disadvantage of pumping the throttle is that when you pump the throttle, you pour fuel into the intake of the engine that can then go into the ground or into cowling and create a fire hazard. But if you use the primer, what you're doing is injecting fuel directly into the cylinders, where it should be anyway for starting, and so it's much safer from a fire standpoint to use primer than pumping the throttle, and it's also more effective. All right, now let's talk about another problem with airplanes during starting time, and that is sticking valves. If you have a rough running engine, particularly one that cures itself, do not assume that it was a fouled spark plug or a magneto problem, because magneto problems, by and large, do not cure themselves. Rough-running engines that cure themselves typically is a sign of a sticking valve. And it'll idle rough until the engine gets warm, and then the engine runs properly. Don't think, just because the engine is now running properly, that you've got a fixed engine. Engines do not heal themselves. It is a problem that will reoccur, and it's going to get worse, not better. So if you have a rough-running engine, suspect something besides the obvious things, and one thing to suspect is the possibility that it might just be a sticking valve. How do you look for a sticking valve? Well, very, very carefully, before the first flight of the day, pull the prop through by hand. Now, if a valve is stuck closed, the prop will get hung up on one cylinder, won't pull through. If a valve is stuck open, there will be no compression. It'll just go right through that cylinder. So one of the things you need to think about if you suspect an engine has a sticking valve is very carefully pull the prop through. And once again, anytime an engine is running rough, don't make any assumptions. Don't assume it cleared up because a mag isn't fouled anymore. Consider at least a sticking valve. Now, let's assume today you're flying big iron. You're flying a multi-engine airplane, and you want to synchronize the propellers. Well, there's a lot of people who synchronize propellers by moving both propellers around until they get them to the same, moving both prop handles until they listen to it and it sounds the same. But the real easy way to synchronize the propellers on a multi-engine airplane is set one engine at the desired RPM and then sync the other prop by reducing it to the same RPM, and you can hear the warbling goes away. Why reducing it? Well, when you're reducing the RPM, propeller governing is more highly damped and it works more smoothly, and the props are easier to sync if one prop RPM is being adjusted downward. It's easier to adjust it smoothly when you're doing it downward. All right, another good, solid, everyday rule of thumb is, let's assume you have an airplane that has major electrical accessories like electric landing gear and flaps. Well, operate only one major electrical accessory at a time. Why? Well, simply you're putting a tremendous load on the electrical system of the aircraft if you're operating them both at the time, and they're more likely to fail. You're likely to have circuit breaker pop, alternator circuit breaker go out, and it'd be the very worst time. It's when you're trying to put your gear and flaps down. So if you operate them one at a time, you're going to minimize that possibility that's going to happen to you. Now, finally, one other operating helpful hint is you should actuate carburetor heat off before initiating a go-around. In other words, turn carburetor heat off before you do a go-around. Why? Because carburetor heat results in having hot air going into your engine. Hot air is less dense, so the engine has less horsepower. And the high fuel air intake temperatures favor detonation and pre-ignition. So you're just doing yourself a tremendous favor if you get rid of carburetor heat before you do a go-around. Well, that's a few helpful engine operating hints and airplane flying hits. I hope you've enjoyed them as much as I have.
All those points sure do make sense. It sounds like some of those items might have come from experience, John. Is that right?
You got that right, Martha. And you know what experience is, don't you? Experience is the ability to recognize a mistake when you've made it again. Next, Martha will cover just a few federal aviation regulations that all pilots need to know to stay legal and safe.
Now, when we talk about using the regulations to be better and safer pilots, one of the things you always need to remember is that the federal aviation regulations really are very minimum requirements, and they are not necessarily safe requirements. They're just the basic minimums that the law requires. For instance, the requirement that you make 3 takeoffs and landings in the same category and class of aircraft in the previous 90 days before you carry passengers, in and of itself, if that's all you've done, and if you did it 90 days ago and haven't flown for 90 days, that may not make you today a safe pilot. It does make you a legal minimum pilot, but that doesn't necessarily make you safe. So when you look at any of the federal aviation regulations, you need to take them with a grain of salt, so to speak, and apply a little common sense and judgment. Make sure you're going to be safe as well as meet the minimum legal requirement. Now, in regard to your currency requirements and also to some inspections on the aircraft, the only currency requirement that goes to the same day is that requirement for the 3 takeoffs and landings in the preceding 90 days. That one goes to the same day, 90 days later. But everything else is based on calendar months, and by FAA definition, calendar month means it goes to the end of the month. For instance, your instrument currency, your IFR currency is good for 6 calendar months, so it expires on the last day of the month 6 months later. The biennial flight review is good for 24 calendar months, goes to the last day of the month 24 months later. Now, by the way, on the instrument currency and the biennial flight review, that is a change from the way it used to be. The FAA has changed it to make it a little bit more consistent with some the other checks and tests that have to be done. The aircraft annual inspection goes for 12 calendar months, good for 12 calendar months. The transponder and altimeter check that have to be done are good for 24 calendar months. And the third class medical on the pilot is also good for 24 calendar months. So the only currency that you have to worry about going to the day is those 3 takeoffs and landings within the preceding 90 days. Now, we mentioned that transponder and altimeter checks. There's also some time limits on ELT batteries. We also mentioned the annual inspection. Who is responsible, do you suppose, for determining if the aircraft is within the time limits on these different tests and inspections? The mechanic, the owner, or the operator of the aircraft? Who do you suppose is responsible? Well, if you answered any of those, mechanic, owner, or operator, you are dead wrong, because you know who's responsible? The pilot is the one who is responsible. Sure enough, the regulations make it very clear that, quote, no person may operate an aircraft unless these have been done, and therefore you, the pilot, are the one who are responsible for making sure that whatever tests and inspections on the aircraft are applicable to your particular flight have been done before you get in and fly the aircraft. Now, probably the easiest of the Federal Aviation regulations to unknowingly violate is Regulation 61.60. 61.60 talks about, of all dramatic things, your mailing address. And it says if you've changed your permanent mailing address more than 30 days ago and have not yet notified the FAA of what your new mailing address is, you are not allowed to exercise the privileges of your pilot certificate. In other words, you can't fly. Now, how are you going to get back in the air? All you have to do is notify in writing, so that they can easily update their records, the Department of Transportation. You send notice to the Department of Transportation, the Federal Aviation Administration, Airman Certification Branch, Box 25082 in Oklahoma City at 73125. Tell them what your new address is, and then you can fly again. Now, you look at that and you say, well, okay, that's a legal requirement, but how does that help make me a better and safer pilot? One of the things that you get as a pilot is a lot of educational material that is mailed to the address that the FAA shows for you on their master pilot registry. If they do not have the proper address for you, you're not going to get all of these letters and notices and various other pieces of educational material that are coming out to you. And a lot of that stuff comes not just from other companies, companies that are trying to sell you something, for instance, or make you aware of things and new developments, but it also comes in official type notices from the FAA. For instance, changes in your local terminal control area, notices about major military exercises that are taking place in military airspace, special use airspace near your location or on routes close to your area that you might be traveling. If the FAA does not have your correct address on their mailing list, you're not going to be getting any of those notices, any of that information, and you're going to miss out on knowing about those kinds of changes. Now, in addition to the clearance and communications requirements for operating in an airport traffic area that are covered in the airspace section of this course, there are also some speed limits in an airport traffic area that you need to be aware of. The speed limit for a reciprocating engine-powered aircraft, which is a fancy way of saying a piston-powered engine, the speed limit in an airport traffic area for a piston-powered engine is 156 knots. The speed limit, on the other hand, for a turbine-powered aircraft is 200 knots, and these are given in indicated airspeed. They're trying to keep the speeds of like types of aircraft down below certain maximum figures so that people don't get run over in the airport traffic area. Now, in addition to these speed limits in the airport traffic area, there are some additional speed limits you should be aware of. First of all, if you're flying at and above 10,000 feet MSL, there isn't any speed limit at all. At and above 10,000 feet MSL, you can go as fast as your airplane is capable of flying. And up there, because of that, the weather minimums that you have to have increase. Because if people can go barreling along at any speed their airplane is capable of doing, they want to give you some better chance to watch out for other aircraft. So when you're flying at and above 10,000 feet, be aware that you can have all kinds of aircraft up there operating at whatever the maximum capability of the aircraft is, and you're not going to have as much opportunity, as much lead time in seeing them because of those speeds. Now, what if you're operating below 10,000 feet MSL? Well, there's a lot more general aviation aircraft down below that altitude, and the FAA kind of tames things down a little bit on the speeds in order to try and keep airplanes from getting run down. So if you are operating below 10,000 feet MSL, the general airspeed limit is 250 knots indicated airspeed. These are always in knots and always in indicated airspeeds. They don't want you having to calculate true airspeeds while you're flying along. How about around a terminal control area? If you are flying under a terminal control area, they slow people down because there's a lot of planes jammed up under there trying to maneuver around the edges of the TCA. And to keep them from running into each other, or at least try to a little bit, if you are operating under a TCA, the general speed limit there is 200 knots indicated airspeed. What if you're operating within a terminal control area, in an airport traffic area inside a terminal control area? Remember, we said a minute ago that normally in an airport traffic area, piston airplanes have a speed limit of how much did we say? 156 knots, that's right. And turbine airplanes, how much? 200 knots indicated airspeed. But in a terminal control area, you're playing with the big boys. That's where the airlines are operating primarily. So anytime you're inside a terminal control area, the speed limit for everybody anywhere is 250 knots indicated airspeed, even if you're inside the airport traffic area. Playing with the big boys, they're going to keep you up to their speed. Aerobatics, acrobatic flight, can be an awful lot of fun, but there are some places where you are not allowed, usually, to do acrobatic flight. The places where you are not allowed to do acrobatic flight are these. First of all, over a congested area, like downtown. You're not allowed to do it over the center of a town, a congested area. Any congested area. You're not allowed to do acrobatics over an open-air assembly of persons. They don't want you flying over the Super Bowl and doing acrobatics. You're not allowed to do acrobatics within a control zone or on a federal airway. Not there. Nor are you allowed to do acrobatics below 1,500 feet above ground level. They want you to be at least 1,500 feet above the ground if you're going to be doing acrobatics, and they also want you to be able to see other airplanes and other airplanes to be able to see you, so you cannot do acrobatics when the flight visibility is less than 3 miles. Okay, so you look at that and you say, well, what about all of these people who do these fancy things right off the ground at all the air shows around the country? Well, that's very simple. Those acrobatic pilots have demonstrated their competence at low-altitude maneuvers to the FAA, and they get a waiver. They're given a waiver for the air show, and they're given a low-altitude waiver so that they can do this kind of aerobatics low over the ground. But unless you've got a specific waiver for low-altitude aerobatics, you're not allowed to do them low altitude, and these are the places where you cannot do aerobatics. Now, what is the definition of aerobatic or acrobatic flight? It is any intentional maneuver that involves an abrupt change in an aircraft's altitude, an aircraft attitude, abnormal attitude, or abnormal acceleration that is not necessary for normal flight. Intentional maneuver with an abrupt change in the attitude, an abnormal attitude, or abnormal acceleration, which you don't have to do for normal flight. So according to that definition, do you think spins would fit that definition? Yeah, according to that definition, spins are definitely acrobatic flight. How about stalls? Are they acrobatic flight? Yes, stalls are also acrobatic flight. And if you want to be legal when you're practicing stalls or spins, make certain that you meet those above conditions, those criteria, in order to make sure that you're legal, because they do constitute acrobatic flight. Let's assume that you're taking some passengers along, and you're flying just a single-engine, four-seater aircraft, do you suppose that you have to brief them on how to fasten and unfasten seat belts just like they do in airline operations? You bet your life you do. The FAA has had some tragic experience with people who have not been able to get out of aircraft because they just simply have not understood how to release their seatbelts and shoulder harnesses. So they have a regulation that says that before takeoff, the pilot has to make sure that everybody on board has been briefed on how to fasten and unfasten their seatbelt and their shoulder harness so that they can get out if you crash and burn, get out of there in case there's a problem. Even if you've got a whole plane full of pilots as your passengers, you need to brief them anyway to be legal. And besides, they may not have flown for a while, they may have forgotten. Now, this is not a regulatory requirement, but it's something you really ought to do also, and that is to brief your passengers, pilots or non-pilots, on how to get out of the aircraft, how to use both the regular exit and, if the airplane is large enough to have emergency exits, how to get out of the emergency exits. Different aircraft have different ways of closing and locking the door. Emergency exits operate in different ways. And if that airplane crashes on takeoff or landing, you're really not going to have time to explain to anyone how to open the doors and get out. And if you're knocked out, the passengers really have to be able to do it on their own. So even though it's not a legal requirement, it certainly would be a lot safer if you brief your passengers on how to open and close the doors and any emergency exits that you have. There are some fuel reserve requirements for flight under VFR conditions that we should review. If you're flying under VFR conditions, now this is VFR, this is not for IFR flight, but for VFR flight, you have to have enough fuel to be able to fly to your point of intended landing and at normal cruising speed have a daytime reserve for another 30 minutes. So in the daytime, you need a 30-minute reserve fuel. If you're flying at night VFR, your reserve goes up from 30 minutes to 45 minutes. Now, if you're flying a helicopter day or night, you have a much shorter fuel requirement, reserve requirement, I guess because they figure you can set the helicopter down in more places safely. So for helicopters, day or night, the fuel requirement for the reserve is only 20 minutes fuel reserve. These are minimums. And this in particular is a place that I would advise you to take a look at it and apply some real common sense, a real test of judgment. Because is a 30-minute fuel reserve in the daytime really going to be enough? Let's assume that you've gotten the weather forecast and the airport weather is good in terms of ceiling and visibility, but there's thunderstorms in the vicinity. A thunderstorm could move over the airport, could take it an hour to pass by, and if you only have 30 minutes fuel reserve, you could be in trouble. Now, you say, well, that's fine, I'll just simply go to another airport. That is great as long as you're sure that there is another airport that's going to have good weather in the vicinity. What I'm basically saying is don't leave yourself with only a 30-minute fuel reserve if you don't have other airports in the vicinity that you could use as an alternate if something goes wrong. Something goes wrong with the weather. Maybe something goes wrong as far as the runway is concerned at your destination. If the pilot before you crashes on the runway, it could take them a lot longer than 30 minutes to get that runway open again. No big deal if there's 2 or 3 other airports in the general area that you can land at. No sweat then. Maybe 30 minutes is adequate. But if the airport you're going to is the only one for, say, 30 or 45 minutes flying time, then put some real thought into whether you consider 30 minutes to be a safe minimum, even though it may be a legal minimum. Now, when you're landing at an airport that has an operating control tower, there's an interesting regulation regarding the use of the visual approach slope indicator, the use of the VASI system. If you're coming in to land at an airport with a tower, an operating tower, and the runway you're landing on has a VASI, that visual approach slope indicator on it, and you remember that's the red and white lights at the side of the runway that tell you whether you're coming in too high or too low on final, the regulation says you have to maintain an altitude at or above that visual glide slope until a lower altitude is necessary for a landing. That seems pretty logical. It makes sense. It's safe that you should try and stay on the VASI, keep the glide slope, the visual glide slope of that VASI as you come in on the approach. And that'll help make sure that you miss any obstructions coming in on the approach. The interesting thing is that that regulation only applies if you're landing at an airport that has an operating control tower. What if the airport you're going into has a VASI on the runway, but it doesn't have any control tower? What then? Then you can fly any way you want to as far as the VASI is concerned. You can come in way low under it if you want to. The regulation does not apply. That is the legal minimum, but that's not really what I would call safe. With or without the regulation, with or without a control tower, I think it's still a lot safer to stay at or above the visual glide slope provided by that VASI, regardless of whether there's a tower there. It's going to make for a lot safer approach to that airport.
Well, you made the comment, Martha, that the federal aviation regulations don't necessarily keep us safe. Don't you think they should be changed so that they are safe?
Well, no, the problem with that is the only way to have absolute total safety in an airplane is to leave it parked on the ground.
I guess then the idea is the federal aviation regulations are just guidelines for good judgment. And if you exercise good judgment, you'll almost always be both legal and safe.
That's very true. And next, John is going to give us some information about your pilot's operating handbook that just might surprise you.
All right, let's see if you and I can make some sense out of the Pilot's Operating Handbook. And when I'm talking about the Pilot's Operating Handbook, I'm not talking about the information manual. For instance, this happens to be here, an information manual for a 1980 Skyhawk, and it applies to every 1980 Skyhawk built. Now, I'm talking about the Pilot's Operating Handbook, and that applies only to your aircraft. It's also called the Flight Manual, and it must be in your aircraft when it flies. And it's a booklet prepared for your specific individual airplane, and it must be brought up to date with all the service bulletins and AD notes, airworthiness directives that are issued. So with this in mind, we're going to talk about this flight manual or Pilot's Operating Handbook. One of the questions I want to ask is, if your airplane happens to have a spinner, is it legal to operate your airplane without your prop spinner? And the chances are probably not. And the way you find out is by looking at your Pilot's Operating Handbook for your airplane and looking at the equipment list for your airplane. So here's the equipment list, and you're going to find there are part numbers for the equipment list in your airplane. Each part will have a number, and there's a suffix to the number. And if the suffix has an R in it, that's a required item, and it must be on the aircraft. So if your spinner is listed with a -R, it's required, and it must be on the aircraft according to FAA certification. If it has an S behind it, it's a standard equipment item, and some standard equipment items do not have to be on the aircraft at all times. For instance, Cherokee 140s, it was standard to equip these airplanes with wheel fairings, but during the winter time, it was perfectly legitimate practice, and still is if you own one of these, to take the wheel fairings off during winter time. So that's a standard item, does not always have to be on the aircraft. There's also optional equipment items which replace required or standard items, and then there's additional optional equipment which you can add to the aircraft. These items do not have to be on the aircraft at all times. So the way you find out whether or not a particular item is a required item on your aircraft is look at the suffix and the part number, and your spinner, chances are, is a required item. Chances are it must be on the aircraft when it flies at all times. Now, another thing to look at is incidental items will be included in your weight and balance. For instance, the tow bar, if you look down here, is included in the weight and balance empty weight calculations for your aircraft. And this happens to be a Mooney in this particular case, and you notice there's a spinner and it's installed and it's included in the weight and balance, and that means if you wanted to fly this airplane without the spinner, and you can't because it's a required item in this case, but if you wanted to fly this airplane, for instance, without an oil cooler, you'd have to recalculate the weight and balance. So remember that you can't just go take things off of the airplane that are in the weight and balance documents of the aircraft, particularly the empty weight calculation. Now notice in this particular case, item 1H here is the tow bar. And the tow bar, and there's also jack points, I want to talk about each of these. These are items that are in the empty weight and balance calculation of the aircraft, and believe it or not, to legally fly this airplane, this tow bar must be in the aircraft when it flies. Also the jack points and the wing tie-down rings and the fuel cup sampler are all things that must be in this aircraft when it flies. And let's take a look. We'll go across to the right here and take a look at it. For instance, here's the tow bar, and as we move across to the right, you'll notice it has a weight of 1.25, and it's got a specific spot that it's designed to be stowed in. If we go across here, we find it's designed to be stowed in 95.5 arms. So there's a specific spot for the tow bar, the jack points, and the jack points are little things that can be unscrewed and removed from the airplane, as well as the wing tie-down rings for Mooney can be actually unscrewed from the airplane. And to legally fly this airplane, these things must be stowed, because you notice it says stowed down here, and that means you must actually stow them in the proper place. It is illegal to fly this particular airplane with the tow bar just slung in the back seat and not properly stowed. It is illegal to fly this airplane with the tie-down wings still attached to the tie-down rings still attached to the wings. What you have to do is unscrew them and stow them in the proper place. Well, I don't think that's really going to be a terrible safety item. It just might be a legality item when you get an inspection by the FAA, but it's an important point to know that you must fly the airplane according to the flight manual, the pilot's operating handbook, and you must also fly the airplane according to the weight and balance data for the aircraft and however they calculated the empty weight of the aircraft. Well, now let's go on a little bit further and talk a little bit on the pilot's operating handbook about the performance data for an aircraft. And they're going to give you figures when you do the performance data for the aircraft, things for short field takeoff, accelerate, stop distance. And let me ask you a question. Do you think that you're going to match the figures shown in the pilot's operating handbook? And the answer is not only no, but heck no. And the reason not is that these figures are how aircraft manufacturers sell airplanes. And these are done with a brand new airplane, with a brand new engine, a maximum performance effort with a professional test pilot. No additional antennas on the airplane producing drag, and they're doing everything they can to get the best results. Now, do you think that you, with a used airplane, an occasional flyer, maybe not a full-time professional test pilot by any means, and a used engine with antennas protruding all over the aircraft are going to get the same results? The answer, once again, is not only no, but heck no. So don't count on the manufacturer's data to be reality for your airplane. So the answer is you should allow for a safety margin when using manufacturer's performance data. For instance, when you compute a takeoff over a 50-foot obstacle, and let's do a short field takeoff here. Let's assume we're going to do one. They give you this information. When you compute it, what you want to do is add on a little extra for safety. For instance, they say the weight of 2,300 pounds, your takeoff speed, knots indicated airspeed, at liftoff would be 48, 53 at 50 feet. Now, those are good figures because they tell you how you're going to get the best performance out of the airplane. But they say at sea level, for instance, and so let's go over here for a temperature of about 20 degrees Celsius, they say that you're going to clear a 50-foot obstacle in 1,440 feet. Well, the chances are you're not going to, because once again, you don't have a new airplane, you're not willing to do a maximum performance effort, and you don't have a brand new engine and so on. So what I do as a rule of thumb, there's two ways to look at it. You can add 50 or 100% to this figure, even double the figure, then you might have a safe figure. Another thing is if you want to know the ground run figure, use the total to clear 50-foot obstacle figure instead. In other words, the actual book ground roll is 805. Well, I use 1440 as my figure, and I say that I must have 1,440 feet of runway just for the ground roll for my airplane. So what the point we're trying to make here is that be careful with these figures. The FAA does something on the FAA written exam that I think is a little unfortunate, is that they'll sometimes have you make interpolations between two figures. They'll give you 10 degrees Celsius and 20 degrees Celsius, and they'll say, got to figure exactly halfway between the two. And that kind of implies that these charts are that accurate and you're going to be able to do that well. Well, the fact is, for your airplane, under your circumstances, these charts aren't that accurate and you're not going to do that well. So what you really want to do is be going to the next higher figure. If the temperature is 15 degrees C, what you want to do is choose a figure for 20 degrees C and then add a little extra on top of that. And that'll give you a little room for error because your airplane's not going to do as well. All right, now let's take a look at another chart, just a second to look at it, just give you an idea. There's also accelerate stop distance charts for twin engine airplanes, and just a whole idea that you're not going to do as well. Here's an accelerate stop distance chart right here, and what they're saying is you're going down the runway in a twin engine airplane and you have an engine fail. and this airplane weighs 5,500 feet, 5,500 pounds, and your engine fails at 92 knots indicated airspeed. You're at sea level, and so as we go across here to the right, we'll look for the temperature as we move along here. We'll say 20 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is your temperature. And what they're going to say here is that you can have all of this happen. You can have an engine fail on takeoff when you're at 90 knots, and you're going to be able to get this airplane accelerated to that speed and stopped in 3,740 feet. Well, you might, as a professional test pilot, when you know in advance that engine is going to fail, and you know in advance, you've practiced, and you know in advance exactly what you're going to do, and you're very recent and very sharp. But you, flying your multi-engine airplane, have an engine fail. The first few seconds you're going to say, what's that? What the heck is going on? And then you say, oh, maybe it's an engine, and you've used a couple more thousand feet of runway. So once again, these are maximum performance, maximum effort figures with a sharp pilot who knows it's going to happen to him. And you don't have all that going for you, so at least a 50 or 100% margin would be a real reasonable figure to keep you out of the trees at the end of the runway. Let's talk about a couple other things you're going to find in the pilot's operating handbook or the flight manual, and one of them is the emergency procedures section will give you, for instance, the best glide speed. And it'll be for a given weight and a given distance for a given height above the terrain, gives you all of that information. So let's take a look at this. Let's assume, for instance, in this particular airplane that you're at an altitude about 1 mile high, 5,280 feet, and you have the engine quit. You're going to learn that you're going to be able to glide about 8 miles, and that's pretty much a rule of thumb. About an 8-to-1 glide ratio is what you're going to get out of most personal general aviation type airplanes. Now that means for every mile the airplane is up, it can glide 8 miles in any direction. Now the point I want to point out about this is a lot of people, particularly members of the general public who aren't pilots like you and I, are very concerned about what they're going to do in an engine failure and what their options are. I just want to make it clear how great your options are. What this means, if you're out over this town of Strawberry Point and your engine quits, you have 8 miles in any direction to glide. Now, we'll talk about how many square miles that is. It's an enormous number of square miles. We'll talk about it in just a second. But what this means is that an airplane, as you know, stalls somewhere under 70 miles per hour. The FAA certificates all single-engine airplanes to stall under 70 miles an hour. Most of them stall around 50 or 60 miles an hour. So landing in a cornfield or a field or an empty road is an equivalent to driving your car off the road at 50 or 60 miles an hour. If you had an 8-mile radius to do this in, do you think you could drive your car off the road without getting anybody killed? Well, the answer is yeah, you probably could. If you could pick a whole radius, this whole area to do it somewhere in there, you could probably find a spot. So what I'm saying is, given these circumstances, if you're a mile high, you have a tremendous area in which to put this airplane down in some plot of land at 50 or 60 miles an hour. Let's talk about how big an area you've got. Remember, the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared. So pi, as you probably have got memorized right away, is 3.14 times the radius, which was 8 miles. Square that, that's 64 miles. Multiply 3.14 times 64 miles, and you and I just now found out that we have a 201 square mile area that we can land this airplane in. So the point that we're making here is your glide ratio of your airplane in a single-engine airplane is roughly 8-to-1, and if you're a mile high, you have 200 square miles in which to put your airplane down, and that's going to give you a lot of room if you keep your head about you. So it should make you feel better already. Let's talk about another thing the performance section of your pilot's operating handbook talks about, and that is the calibration table between calibrated airspeed and indicated airspeed. And we're going to talk about, of course, using the calibration table. Now, the difference between indicated airspeed and calibrated airspeed is position error. Indicated airspeed is what your airspeed indicator indicates, and calibrated airspeed is what it would indicate if you didn't have either position error from the static source or instrument error also. But we'll talk about position error, and when we're talking about position error, we're talking about the position of the pitot tube, but probably most important, the position of the static source causes most of the differences between indicated airspeed and calibrated airspeed. Now, did you ever wonder why the indicated and calibrated airspeed are very close to each other near cruise and above, but considerably different at stall speeds? Well, the reason for that is the way airplanes are certificated. Airplanes are certificated so that 1.3 times the stall speed in clean configuration, by the way, that's very close to your approach speed to land at the airport, By regulation, the error in your airspeed indicator, difference between calibrated and indicated airspeed, cannot be more than 3% of the calibrated airspeed, or 5 knots, whichever is greater. So that's why you see when you're near cruise speed, here we got 80 and 90, they're very close to each other, 90 and 89. But when you get very, very slow, 40 and 50, there gets to be a big difference between each other. Why is that by accident? No, the airplane is certificated that for speeds from about 1.3 times stalling speed and up to cruise speed, the airspeed indicator is certificated to be very, very accurate. So the manufacturers are required by the regulations to make it accurate in that standpoint. A couple other speeds you're going to get from your pilot's operating handbook are best rate of climb speed and best angle of climb speed. You know, typically when you look at your pilot's operating handbook and get these speeds, you're going to get them for sea level, but they change with altitude. So let's talk a little bit about the variation of best rate of climb and best angle of climb with altitude. What you're going to find as you go to higher altitude, the best rate of climb airspeed, typically in knots indicated airspeed is the way they're going to describe this, usually decreases with altitude, while the best angle of climb speed is almost constant with altitude and slightly increasing. And what's going to happen, you notice the best rate of climb speed here decreases with altitude as you go up, and the best angle of climb speed stays pretty much constant but slightly increases as you go to higher altitude. And for instance, in this particular airplane, the best angle of climb speed at sea level is around 64. Take it up to 10,000 feet and maybe 66, something like that. But the best rate of climb speed starts out about 88 at sea level, but as you go up to 10,000 feet, it's down to about 74. So there's quite a change in your best rate of climb speed with altitude. So as you go to higher and higher altitudes, if you want to maintain optimal rate of climb, that's best altitude gained over time, you're going to be gradually decreasing the speed of the airplane until you get to basically what is going to be the absolute ceiling of the aircraft. In this case, it might be around 15,000 feet. And what's going to happen to you then, if you slow this airplane up anymore, it's going to start descending on you. If you speed the airplane up a little bit, it's going to start descending. A lot of people will say, well, what happens when you get to the absolute ceiling of the aircraft and try and go higher? Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. A lot of people say the airplane will stall. Well, not unless you pull completely back on the wheel. What's really going to happen is you attempt to climb higher by slowing the airplane down a little bit more, the airplane will just simply start descending. So that's the reason you have an absolute ceiling in part, is you've gotten to the point where you best rate of climb speed is right at best angle of climb speed. You slow the airplane down, it's going to start descending. Speed the airplane up, it's going to start descending. And that's because of the behavior of best rate of climb, best angle of climb. A good rule of thumb is simply to remember that the best angle of climb speed stays about the same with altitude or increases slightly. So short field takeoffs, you wouldn't want to make a major amendment in your best angle of climb speed even though you were at higher altitude. Just a few knots increase in your best angle of climb speed even at high altitudes. But best rate of climb speed, if you're trying to get performance at altitude, you need to remember, of course, you're going to have to decrease your rate of climb with altitude. You would want to look that figure up for your own airplane, but it's nice to know that that's what you're going to have to do. Do you ever wonder how the colored arcs and markings are established on the airspeed indicator? Are they arbitrary? Well, of course they're not arbitrary. They're actually established by FAA regulations. Some of them are obvious. The bottom of the green arc is stalling speed of the aircraft in clean configuration. The bottom of the white arc is stalling speed of the aircraft in dirty configuration, at least with the flaps down. Top of the white arc is the maximum speed you can fly with the flaps extended. It has to do with the strength of the flaps, how strongly they're built. But how about the top of the green arc? That's called the normal operating range, or VNO, and that's also called design cruise speed. Is that arbitrary? Well, of course it's not arbitrary. Everything about the design of an airplane is covered by the Federal Aviation Regulations, and including the top of the green arc, or VNO. Now, what we need to know about the top of the green arc is that there is a way you arrive at this figure. First of all, every airplane is built so that at the top of the green arc it can take a gust of a certain velocity, depending on how that airplane was certificated, and the airplane must be built that strong. And it depends on what year the airplane was certificated and what category the airplane was certificated, but it's anywhere from a 30 to 50 feet per second sharp edge gust, and the airplane's got to be able to withstand that. Now, one way a manufacturer could cheat is he says, I've only got an airplane that's this strong, not very strong. He says, what I'm going to do is take the bottom of the top of the green arc and move it way down here and not let people fly it fast, and that way they can never damage the airplane. Well, that would rob the airplane of a lot of its utility. If you had a little tiny short segment of green green arc in between the top of the white, for instance, and the top of the green, you wouldn't get much utility out of the aircraft. So the FAA says, no manufacturers, you're going to have to build it strong. You can't just make them slow the airplane down. You're going to have to build the airplane strong. And so therefore, the top of the green arc must be at least a minimum value. So let's talk about the formula for how they arrive at the top of the green arc. And what they do is they take the wing area of the aircraft. The wing area is the weight supported by the wings divided by the square feet. And that's W divided by S in this particular case. Take the square root of that wing loading of the aircraft and multiply that times 33, and that will give you the actual number, the minimum number that they're allowed to use for design cruising speed for an airplane. If you happen to have a Cessna 182 RG, had a weight of 3,100 pounds, you go through this formula with it. The wing area is 174 square feet. The weight of the aircraft is 3,100 pounds, so 3,100 divided by 174, take the square root of that, and it comes out to 4.22. Multiply that times 33, and you get 139 knots calibrated airspeed, and son of a gun, that comes to within just about a knot of the VNO on that particular airplane. So that's how these are arrived at. It's not arbitrary, it's by formula, and what they're saying is the airplane must be able to handle this gust load, but you can't cheat and just make everybody fly it slow. They've got to be able to handle it at a certain speed, and that's how you arrive at that speed. Okay, so much for design cruise speed. Next thing we want to talk about is red line, which is never exceed speed. And there's another speed up here above red line that you're never legally going to be able to fly your airplane, and probably realistically never going to be able to fly it twice at that speed anyway, and that's called design dive speed. Let's talk about how we arrive at those. Well, design dive speed for normal category aircraft must be a certain minimum speed, and that speed is 1.4 times that design cruise speed that we just figured out. Now, for this airplane we were just talking about, the design cruise speed, if you remember, was 139 knots, so you multiply that times 1.4, and the design dive speed by regulation must be at least 195 knots. What that means is the manufacturer of this particular airplane who's building this airplane must make the airplane strong enough to be able to sustain a dive at 195 knots and not have control system flutter and not have special problems involved with that. And they've got to be able to not only design it, but they've got to be able to test it for that. So they go out and they test fly the airplane at design dive speed. Then they back off and multiply that times 0.9, and that becomes never exceed speed, VNE, and that's the top of the yellow arc or red line on the airspeed indicator, and for this particular airplane it becomes 175 knots. Now, the thing you need to remember is that this airplane was tested once at design dive speed with a test airplane, a professional test pilot, and he did not at that time have some of the problems we're talking about. Now, the problems you run into when you get above never exceed speed, a lot of people think, well, the wings are going to be torn off the airplane. Well, that's really not essentially what the problem is. The problem is you're likely to have control system flutter. You know, if you stick your tie out the window of an airplane at certain speeds, your tie will start fluttering. Well, at certain speeds on an airplane, the aileron, elevator, and rudder will start fluttering. They'll flutter so bad they flutter completely off the airplane. You say, hey, there went my aileron. Goodbye, aileron. The airplane rolls over in its back and then makes contact with the ground. That's when you have structural damage. But first you get control system flutter. So the primary reason they have designed a never exceed speed into an airplane is because they want to avoid control system flutter. And as airplanes age, control system flutter gets more likely because the actual weight of the aileron or control surface and how it's balanced is extremely important. And as you get paint chips, as you get dust, as you get insects building nests in ailerons, they're going to flutter at a lower speed, also the elevator and rudder. So the airplane that might have successfully been able to pass a flutter test when it was a new airplane may not when it becomes an older airplane because the control systems aren't balanced as well. So it's a very, very good idea that once again you add some margin for error to all these design speeds in an airplane.
Well, now, let me see. If what you said was it was to take the operations manual of an aircraft with a grain of salt. Is that right, John?
You bet, Martha. Maybe even a block of salt. You know, a lot of pilots get in trouble because they believe they can actually duplicate those figures. Here's a case where a little mistrust is a good thing.
Maybe even a lot of mistrust. I hope you've enjoyed Rules to Fly By as much as we've enjoyed putting it together. Have fun flying, but please,
stay out of the trees.
This red-hot Tobago can be yours. Exciting is the only word for this sizzling sports car of the air from Aerospecial. You'll love its seductive lines, dramatic gull-wing doors, and outstanding performance and comfort. And you'll have a spectacular avionics package by Narco to match this exceptional airplane. But to win, you must enter King School's newest Super Takeoff Sweepstakes. And your order of any King course automatically enters you to win. King's exciting takeoff videos take you beyond the written. Choose from a library of 13 informative and entertaining videos, including King's newest titles, Maneuvers for the Commercial Pilot and Flight Instructor, and Night Flying. The highly acclaimed King written exam courses are always up to date and thorough, and feature super monster graphics, 3D animation, and exciting live-action video to make learning easy, interesting, and fun. If you want to pass an aviation mechanics written, or just want to know more about your airplane, you'll want the King Aviation Mechanics exam courses. After you've taken your King video course, let King's computerized exam review make it fun to ensure a Top Gun score. Choose questions by subject or take them all. Then receive on screen the correct answer with King's comprehensive, detailed explanation. Your computer will track your progress, allowing you to select unanswered or previously missed questions. King's report card will highlight the areas you need to concentrate on to improve your score. At your option, your final exam emulates the FAA's Play-Doh computerized testing system. King flight test courses prepare you for your check ride. An actual FAA examiner tells you what is expected for every task, and your instructor shows you how to demonstrate your knowledge in the cockpit and on the ground. For a better value, get your exam course, flight test course, and your choice of 4 takeoff videos for only $169. For your best value, order your exam course, flight test course, and the entire 13-video King Takeoff library for only $259. Phone your order in now. Call 1-800-854-1001. That's 1-800-854-1001 and win this red-hot Tobago.